Gregory Dawson sat on a concrete bench near the Nana BTS station at 3 in the morning, his worldly possessions stuffed into a weathered backpack beside him. The bench had become his bedroom. The public toilet at the nearby 7-Eleven was his bathroom. The leftover rice and chicken from street vendors who took pity on him was his dinner. 18 months earlier, Greg had been a millionaire. He'd owned a luxury condo in Bangkok's most prestigious building. He'd had $1.2 million in the bank. He'd had a beautiful girlfriend who talked about marriage and building a future together. Now he had nothing. Less than nothing. His visa had expired 3 weeks ago. Technically, he was in Thailand illegally. But he had no money for a flight home. No money for an overstay fine. No money for anything except survival. The other homeless foreigners who gathered near Sukhumvit knew his story. Everyone had a version of it. Men who'd come to Thailand with money and left with nothing. Some had been scammed by bar girls. Others by fake business deals. Greg had been destroyed by something more sophisticated, a woman who'd played the role of devoted partner while systematically dismantling his entire life. Her name was Patcharaporn Srisawan. Everyone called her Molly, and she'd taken everything from him while making him believe he was the luckiest man in Thailand. If you've been enjoying the stories I create, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps me dedicate time to making these videos despite my commitment to a full-time job. Thank you for being here. Gregory Dawson built his fortune through timing, skill, and relentless work ethic. He'd started his software company in Seattle in 1998, right as the internet was exploding. The company specialized in database management solutions for mid-sized businesses, not sexy, but profitable. By 2005, they had 300 clients. By 2010, 1,500. Greg had never married. He'd come close twice, once in his 30s, once in his 40s, but both relationships had fallen apart over the same issue. He prioritized work over everything else. He'd spend 80 hours a week at the office, travel constantly for client meetings, miss birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. Both women had eventually given him ultimatums. Both times, he'd chosen work. By the time Greg turned 60 in 2016, he'd built a company worth significant money, but he'd also realized he'd spent 40 years building something impressive while building nothing personal. No wife, no kids, no close friendships, just business relationships and employees who respected him but didn't know him. A competitor approached Greg that year with an acquisition offer, $8.5 million. Greg accepted. After taxes, legal fees, and settling obligations, he walked away with $5.2 million. He also had another $300,000 in various retirement accounts. He was worth $5.5 million at 60 years old. Wealthy, secure, alone. Greg's therapist, he'd started seeing one after the second engagement failed, asked him what he wanted from the next phase of his life. Greg said he wanted to feel something. For 40 years, he'd felt productive, accomplished, successful. But he'd never felt joy, peace, connection. He'd optimized his life for achievement and forgotten to optimize for happiness. The therapist suggested travel, new experiences, getting out of the bubble Greg had built around himself in Seattle. Greg agreed. He sold his house in Queen Anne another $1 million and became completely liquid, $6.5 million. No property, no obligations, complete freedom for the first time in his life. Greg spent 2 years traveling. Europe, South America, Asia. He moved every few months, stayed in nice hotels, ate at good restaurants, visited museums and historical sites. It was pleasant, educational, but also hollow. He was still alone, just alone in nicer locations. In early 2019, Greg found himself in Bangkok for the third time. Something about the city appealed to him, the energy, the chaos. The sense that life was happening here, in a way it wasn't in Seattle or Paris or Buenos Aires. He decided to stay longer, rented a serviced apartment in Sukhumvit for 3 months. Greg joined expat social groups, started going to networking events, met other foreigners who'd retired to Thailand. Some were living modestly on pensions. Others, like Greg, had money. All of them seemed more content than Greg felt. They'd found something here, community, purpose, a sense of belonging that Greg was still searching for. One of those expats, a British guy named Simon, mentioned an art gallery opening in Thonglar, contemporary Thai artists. Wine, networking. Simon said Greg should come, meet some people, Experience Bangkok's art scene. Greg went. The gallery was tasteful white walls, polished concrete floors, modern pieces that Greg didn't understand but appreciated aesthetically. The crowd was mixed, Thais and foreigners, young and old, artists and collectors. Greg wandered through, wine glass in hand, feeling slightly out of place but interested. That's where he met Pattaya Srizuwan. She was standing in front of an abstract painting, studying it intently. She was stunning late 20s, wearing a black dress that was elegant without being provocative. Her posture, her focus, everything about her suggested intelligence and sophistication. Greg stood beside her, looked at the painting, and said, "I don't understand it, but I like it." She smiled. That's the best response to abstract art. Understanding ruins it. They talked for an hour. Her name was Pattaya, but everyone called her Molly. She worked in real estate commercial properties, helping foreign investors navigate Thai property law. She'd studied business at Chulalongkorn University, spoke 3 languages, and had opinions on everything from Bangkok traffic to global politics. She was articulate, confident, engaging. She asked what brought Greg to Bangkok. He explained the retirement, the travel, the search for something more meaningful than work had been. Molly said she understood that feeling. She'd spent her 20s building her career, sacrificing personal life for professional success. Now, she was reassessing, wondering if success meant something different than she'd believed. They exchanged contact information. Molly suggested meeting for coffee to continue the conversation. Greg agreed, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: genuine interest in another person. Over the next 2 weeks, Greg and Molly met for coffee 3 times, then dinner, then a weekend trip to Pattaya to see the ancient temples. Molly was easy to be with. She didn't expect Greg to entertain her or impress her. She was independent, intellectually curious. She'd ask about his business, his life in Seattle, his thoughts on retirement. She'd share stories about her work, her family in Chiang Mai, her own struggles with loneliness despite being surrounded by people in Bangkok. By the time Greg had been in Bangkok for 2 months, he and Molly were in a relationship. Not casual dating, a real relationship. They'd have dinner together most evenings. She'd stay over at his apartment several nights a week. They'd talk for hours about everything: philosophy, politics, travel, art, the meaning of success. Greg felt intellectually stimulated in a way he hadn't since university. Molly challenged him, made him think, made him feel alive. In June, Greg's 3-month apartment lease was ending. He needed to decide: return to traveling, go back to Seattle, or commit to staying in Bangkok longer. Molly said she'd support whatever he decided. She wasn't trying to trap him. If he needed to keep moving, she understood. But she also said she'd miss him. They'd found something real. That was rare. Greg decided to stay. He rented a larger condo in Thongler for a year, furnished it properly, bought a car. He wasn't just visiting Bangkok anymore. He was living there. Molly helped him with everything. She knew good furniture stores, reliable contractors for condo improvements, where to find Western food when he got homesick, which hospitals expats trusted. She was practical, resourceful, the perfect partner for navigating life in Thailand. By September, Greg was thinking about buying property. Renting felt temporary. If he was serious about Thailand, he should own something, build equity, create a real home. Molly said that made sense but warned him to be careful. Thai property law was complex for foreigners. Lots of scams, lots of ways to lose money if you didn't understand the rules. She offered to help. She worked in real estate. She knew the legal structures. She could connect him with trustworthy lawyers and developers. Make sure he didn't make expensive mistakes. Greg accepted. He trusted Molly completely. She'd proven herself thoughtful, honest, and genuinely invested in his well-being. Unlike his previous relationships, this one felt balanced. Molly had her own career, her own money. She wasn't with him because he was wealthy. She was with him because they connected. Or so Greg believed. Molly showed Greg several condos over the next few weeks. Units in premium buildings in Sukhumvit, Sathorn, and Riverside areas. Prices ranged from 15 to 40 million baht, roughly $450,000 to $1.2 million. Greg's budget was flexible. He could afford any of them. The question was what made sense. Molly suggested buying in a building that allowed foreign ownership but also purchasing through a company structure for tax advantages. It was a common strategy. Foreigners could own condos directly, but company ownership offered benefits: lower tax rates, easier resale, ability to generate rental income more efficiently. Greg asked if that was legal. Molly assured him it was standard practice. Her firm handled these structures regularly. She'd connect Greg with a lawyer who specialized in foreign property ownership, make sure everything was done properly. The lawyer, a woman named Kun Appinya, met with Greg and explained the process. They'd establish a Thai limited company with Greg as a minority shareholder. Thai nationals would hold the majority shares, usually nominees, people who held shares in name only. The company would purchase the condo. Greg would have full use rights through a lease agreement. Upon his death, or if he decided to sell, he'd have legal mechanisms to reclaim the asset. Greg asked about risks. Kun Appinya said the main risk was nominee shareholders claiming actual ownership, but proper contracts mitigated that risk. Greg would have declaration documents from each nominee stating they held shares in trust only, enforceable in Thai courts if ever disputed. It sounded complicated but reasonable. Greg had established corporations in the U.S., understood legal structures. This wasn't fundamentally different, just adapted to Thai law. Molly suggested a condo in a building she'd been admiring. The Ritz-Carlton Residences on Mahanakan. Ultra-luxury. 52nd floor unit. 2 bedrooms. Floor-to-ceiling windows with views across Bangkok. 35 million baht, about $1,050,000. Greg toured the unit. It was spectacular, modern, pristine, the kind of place that announced you'd arrived. He could imagine living there, hosting dinners, watching sunsets, building a life with Molly. He told Kun Appinya to proceed. Bought the unit through the company structure Molly and the lawyer recommended. The company was registered as Mahanakhon Ventures Co. Limited. Greg held 49%. 3 Thai nominees, friends of Molly's, she said, held 51% collectively. Greg paid $1,050,000. The company held the title. Greg signed a 30-year lease with automatic renewal rights. Molly moved in with him a month after the purchase. They furnished the condo together, bought art, chose dishes and linens, made it feel like their home, not just Greg's. She'd cook Thai meals several nights a week. They'd host friends, both Greg's expat acquaintances and Molly's Thai professional network. Life felt rich, full. Greg was 63 years old and happier than he'd ever been. In December, Molly mentioned her brother. His name was Somchai. He worked in construction, specifically luxury villa developments on Thailand's islands. He was talented but struggled with financing. Thai banks didn't love lending to contractors without extensive track records. Molly said Somchai had an opportunity. A land parcel on Koh Samui. 5 rai, about 8,000 square meters. Zoned for residential development. Perfect location hillside with ocean views. He wanted to build 8 luxury villas, sell to foreign buyers. The profit margins were substantial if executed properly. But Somchai needed investment capital, construction costs, land purchase, permits, marketing. He'd been trying to find investors, but most weren't interested in island development during low season. Greg asked why Molly was telling him this. She said because Somchai was family and she trusted Greg's business judgment. If Greg looked at the opportunity and thought it was viable, maybe he'd consider investing, not out of charity, as a real business decision. The returns could be excellent if done right. Greg was interested. He'd made his fortune recognizing good opportunities early. Villa development in Koh Samui could be lucrative. Wealthy foreigners and Thai nationals both loved the island. Limited land, growing demand. If the margins were as good as Molly suggested, this could be a smart investment. He met Somchai in January 2020. Somchai was 40-ish, confident, spoke decent English. He'd brought a full business plan, site analysis, architectural renderings, construction timeline, financial projections. The presentation was professional, impressive. Somchai explained the economics. Land purchase, 6 million baht, about $180,000. Construction costs for 8 villas, 20 million baht, about 600,000. Permits, legal fees, marketing, 4 million baht, about 120,000. Total investment, 30 million baht, about $900,000. Projected sales. Villas would sell for 8 to 12 million baht each. Conservative estimate, 72 million baht total revenue, about $2.1 million. After covering initial investment and selling costs, net profit would be roughly 35 million baht, about $1 million. Greg's return on 900,000 investment, 1 million in profit, split between Greg and Somchai as agreed. It was attractive. Greg asked about risks. Somchai said construction delays were the main concern, weather, labor shortages. But he'd built villas before, knew how to manage timelines. The risk was moderate for the return. Greg said he needed to do due diligence, visit the site, review legal documents, talk to other developers. Somchai said absolutely. Smart investors verified everything. He'd arrange a site visit. 2 weeks later, Greg, Molly, and Somchai flew to Koh Samui. The land was exactly as described. Hillside plot, stunning ocean views, access road already in place, nearby villas selling for good prices. The location was legitimate. Somchai showed Greg permits what he claimed were preliminary approvals from local government, building permits, environmental impact clearances, everything stamped and official looking. Greg couldn't read Thai, but the documents appeared legitimate. Molly vouched for Somchai, said he'd never been dishonest with family. This was his dream project. He'd worked tirelessly to make it successful. Greg did additional research, talked to other developers on Samui. The villa market was strong. Construction costs matched what Somchai had quoted. The timeline seemed realistic. Everything checked out. In March, Greg transferred $900,000 to Mahanakan Ventures Co. Limited, the company structure he'd established for his condo. Somchai was listed as a project manager. The money would be dispersed in stages. 200,000 for land, 600,000 for construction, 100,000 for permits and soft costs. Somchai purchased the land in April. Showed Greg the title documents. Registered to the company. Everything proper. Construction began in May. Somchai sent weekly progress photos. Land clearing. Foundation work. Concrete poured. Things were moving. Greg visited in June. The site showed real progress. 2 villa foundations completed. Workers everywhere. Equipment, materials stockpiled. Somchai walked him through everything. Explained next steps. It looked legitimate, professional. By August, construction was supposedly 40% complete. Somchai said they were on schedule. Greg sent more money as invoiced. Another $200,000. Somchai showed receipts, material purchases, labor costs, everything documented. In September, Molly suggested getting legally married, not for immigration or money, she didn't need that, but for symbolism, commitment. They'd been together a year. They were building a life together, a business together. Marriage would formalize their partnership. Greg agreed. They had a small ceremony at a temple in Bangkok. Just a few friends. Simple, meaningful. Molly became Mrs. Dawson legally. Greg felt complete. 64 years old. Finally married. Finally building the personal life that had eluded him for decades. By October, construction was supposedly 70% complete. Somchai sent photos of nearly finished villas, roofs, windows installed. Interior work progressing. He said completion would be December. Marketing would start immediately after. Pre-sales already generating interest. Greg was excited. His $900,000 investment would return over $1 million in profit. Plus, he'd be married to an amazing woman, living in a luxury condo in Bangkok. Life was exactly what he'd hoped it would be when he retired. Then, November came, and everything started unraveling. Somchai stopped sending weekly updates. Greg messaged him asking for progress photos. Somchai said he'd been busy on site, would send updates soon. Days passed. Nothing. Greg called. No answer. Sent line messages. Read but not responded to. Greg asked Molly what was going on. She said Somchai was probably just overwhelmed. Construction projects got stressful near completion. Lots of details. But she'd call him, find out what was happening. Molly reported back that Somchai said everything was fine, just behind schedule. Thai workers had taken unexpected holidays, weather delays, normal construction problems. He'd send updates next week. Next week came. Still nothing. Greg was getting worried. He'd invested $900,000. Somchai's silence wasn't normal. Greg told Molly he wanted to fly to Samui, see the site personally. Molly said that was smart. She'd come with him, make sure everything was okay. They booked flights for late November. When they arrived on Samui, Greg asked Molly to take him directly to the construction site. She said she didn't remember the exact location. Somchai had always driven them before, but she had the address. They'd find it. They hired a driver, gave him the address from the construction documents, drove into the hills, turned onto a dirt road, climbed higher. The driver said this was the address. But there was nothing there, just jungle, empty land, no construction, no villas, no equipment. Greg felt his stomach drop. This was the correct address, according to every document he'd signed. But there was no development, no sign any construction had ever occurred. Molly looked confused, said maybe they had the wrong coordinates. Maybe the address on the documents was administrative, not the actual site location. She'd call Somchai. Somchai didn't answer. Molly left messages. Sent line messages. Nothing. They drove around Samui looking for the construction site, asked local contractors if they knew about villa development projects. Nobody had heard of Somchai's project. Nobody recognized the company name. Greg and Molly spent 2 days searching. Found nothing. Somchai's phone was off. His line account was still active, but he wasn't responding. Greg was panicking. $900,000. Where was it? Molly seemed as confused and worried as Greg. Said she couldn't understand what was happening. Somchai was her brother. He wouldn't steal. Something else must be going on. They flew back to Bangkok. Greg went directly to Kunapinya's law office, asked her to investigate, check company records, see where the money had gone, verify the land title. Kunapinya did a title search. The land address on Greg's documents didn't exist, not in the government database. There was no registered property at those coordinates. The title documents Somchai had shown were forgeries. Greg asked about the company account. Where had his $900,000 gone? Kunapinya checked banking records. The money had been withdrawn in multiple large cash transactions over 6 months. No paper trail after that. Greg felt like he was going to be sick. He'd been scammed, completely, professionally, by Molly's brother. He went home to the Mahanakan condo, confronted Molly, demanded to know what was going on. Was Somchai really her brother? Did she know about this? Molly seemed devastated. Said yes, Somchai was her brother. But she had no idea he was running a scam. She trusted him, vouched for him to Greg. She felt betrayed too. This was her family, her brother. How could he do this? She cried. Said she'd help Greg find Somchai, get the money back. She'd call her parents in Chiang Mai, figure out where Somchai was. This would be fixed. Greg wanted to believe her. She seemed genuinely shocked, but doubt was creeping in. Had Molly known? Had she been part of this? Over the next week, Molly claimed she was investigating, calling family members, trying to track Somchai, but she had no answers. Somchai had apparently disappeared. Nobody in the family knew where he was. Greg filed a police report. The officer listened, took notes, said unfortunately this was common. Fake development projects, forged documents. The brother was probably not actually Molly's brother, probably a professional con artist. The money was likely gone, converted to cash, impossible to trace. Greg asked if they could at least try to find Somchai. The officer said they'd file a warrant, but without knowing his real identity or location, enforcement was unlikely. Greg asked about Molly. Should she be investigated? The officer asked why. Greg said she'd introduced him to Somchai, vouched for him. The officer said that didn't prove she was involved. She could be a victim too. Unless Greg had evidence she'd knowingly participated in fraud, there wasn't cause to investigate her. Greg went home devastated. $900,000 gone. No villa development. No investment. No return. Just gone. But at least he still had his condo. Still had Molly. Still had something to rebuild from. Or so he thought. In December, Greg decided to liquidate some investments to cover living expenses. He'd spent $900,000 on the villa scam. He still had about $300,000 in accessible funds. But he wanted to be careful, conservative, make sure he could survive on what remained. He contacted his U.S. bank, asked them to transfer $50,000 from his investment account to his Thai bank account. The bank officer said there was a problem. Greg's account had been flagged. Multiple large transfers to Thai accounts had triggered fraud alerts. The bank had frozen the account pending verification. Greg spent 2 weeks verifying his identity, proving the transfers were authorized, finally got access restored. But the process revealed something disturbing. His account balance was lower than expected, significantly lower. Greg had thought he had $300,000 liquid. The account showed $120,000. Where was the other $180,000? Greg reviewed his transaction history, found transfers he didn't recognize. 4 transfers over the past 6 months, each around $40,000 to $50,000, all to accounts in Thailand. All with descriptions like property investment and business venture. Greg didn't remember authorizing those transfers. Asked the bank for details. The transfers had been initiated using Greg's online banking credentials. From his IP address in Bangkok, the bank had no reason to suspect fraud. Everything appeared authorized. But Greg hadn't made those transfers. Someone else had accessed his account. Someone who had his login credentials. Someone in his condo. Greg checked his laptop's browser history, found that his banking website had been accessed multiple times when he wasn't home. The saved password feature had been used. Someone had simply opened his computer and accessed his accounts. Only one person had that kind of access to his laptop. Only one person was regularly in his condo when he wasn't there. Molly. Greg confronted her that evening, showed her the transfers, asked if she knew anything about them. Molly looked at the screen and said no. She had no idea. Maybe his account had been hacked? Maybe someone had stolen his credentials? Greg said the transfers were made from his computer, in his condo. Molly was the only other person who had access. She looked hurt, said she'd never touch his money without permission. How could he accuse her of stealing? But Greg's doubt was now overwhelming. The villa scam, the mysterious transfers, the perfect access to all his accounts. Was Molly a victim, or was she the architect? That night, Greg changed all his passwords, secured his laptop with a fingerprint lock, opened a new bank account and transferred his remaining funds. If Molly was stealing from him, it would stop now. But the damage was done. Of his $1.2 million, $900,000 was gone to the fake villa project. $180,000 had been stolen from his account. He had $120,000 left. His net worth had dropped from $1.2 million to $120,000 in 10 months. In January 2021, Greg decided he needed to leave the Mahanakan condo. Too expensive. Maintenance fees alone were 30,000 baht monthly, about $900. He couldn't sustain that with his reduced finances. He contacted Kun Apina, said he wanted to sell the condo, or rent it out. Generate income, reduce costs, whatever made sense. Kun Apina said she'd review the company documents, see what options existed. 3 days later, Kun Apina called, said there was a problem, a serious problem. The company structure that owned the condo Mahanakan Ventures Co. Limited had been dissolved. The company no longer legally existed. Greg asked how that was possible. Kun Apina said the company had been voluntarily dissolved in December, filed with the Department of Business Development. Someone with signing authority had initiated the dissolution. Molly had signing authority. As Greg's wife, she'd been added as an authorized agent when they married. She could act on behalf of the company for administrative purposes. That was standard for married couples with shared assets. But if the company was dissolved, what happened to the condo? Kun Apina checked the title records. The condo had been sold in early January, transferred to a new owner, a Thai national. Kun Apina provided the name Pacharaporn, Srisuwan. Molly. Molly had dissolved the company, transferred the condo to her personal name, and sold it. The sale proceeds approximately 30 million baht. About $900,000 were gone. Molly's bank account showed a large deposit in early January, followed by multiple withdrawals. The money had been moved immediately. Greg felt the room spinning. His condo, the $1 million property he'd purchased, gone, sold without his knowledge. By his wife? He went home to what he thought was his home and found the locks changed. A security guard stopped him at the building entrance, said the unit owner had changed. Greg was no longer authorized to access the property. He needed to leave. Greg showed his marriage certificate, his lease agreement. The guard called building management. They said the new owner had provided documentation that the previous owner, the company, no longer existed. The property belonged to someone else now. Greg had no legal standing. Greg called Molly. No answer. Sent line messages. Account deleted. Went to her office. She hadn't worked there in months. It was all fake. Everything had been fake. Greg stood on the street outside what had been his building. 64 years old, in a foreign country, with a backpack containing his laptop and some clothes. Everything else was locked in a condo he no longer had access to. He had $120,000, but it was in U.S. accounts, frozen by fraud alerts, would take weeks to access. In his Thai account, he had about 50,000 baht, about $1,500. His credit card still worked, but he was suddenly, catastrophically without resources. He checked into a budget hotel in Sukhumvit. 2,000 baht per night, about $60. He'd stay there while figuring out next steps. But the hotel required upfront payment for a week. He paid. That left him with 35,000 baht, about $1,000. He had to ration carefully until he could access his U.S. funds. Over the next few days, Greg filed police reports, contacted the embassy, hired a lawyer to investigate. The lawyer confirmed what Greg already suspected. Molly and Somchai had run an organized fraud operation. The villa project was entirely fictional. Molly had systematically extracted money from Greg's accounts while positioning herself to take the condo. The marriage was part of the con, giving her legal access to Greg's assets. The lawyer estimated total theft at $1.9 million, $900,000 from the villa scam, $180,000 from unauthorized transfers, $900,000 from the condo sale. Greg was left with $120,000, but even that remaining money was about to disappear. The fraud alerts had frozen Greg's U.S. accounts indefinitely. The bank needed extensive documentation to release funds. Meanwhile, Greg was burning through his Thai baht, staying in hotels and eating. By late January, Greg had been in the budget hotel for 3 weeks. His Thai funds were gone. His credit cards were maxed. His U.S. accounts remained frozen. He couldn't pay for another night at the hotel. The hotel manager sympathetic, but firm said Greg needed to leave. No payment, no room. Greg had nowhere to go. He ended up on the street. Literally. A 64-year-old American millionaire, sleeping on benches near Sukhumvit, using public restrooms, eating leftover food when vendors took pity on him. He'd gone from millionaire to homeless in 18 months, and the woman who destroyed him was gone, vanished, with nearly $2 million. Greg Dawson learned things during his 6 weeks living on Bangkok streets that no business school had taught him. He learned where public water fountains were located, which street vendors would give him leftover food at closing time, which 7-Eleven stores let homeless people use toilets, and which called security, where the police didn't bother you and where they moved you along. He also learned he wasn't unique. There were dozens of homeless foreigners in the Sukhumvit area, men who'd come to Thailand with money and left with nothing. Most were older 50s, 60s, 70s. Most had been scammed. Some by women, some by business partners, some by both. There was an informal network. The homeless foreigners looked after each other, shared information about safe places to sleep, warned about police sweeps, pooled money occasionally for communal meals. It was community built from shared destruction. One of those men was Derek, a British guy in his 70s. He'd lost 300,000 pounds to a bar girl who'd convinced him to buy her a house and then disappeared with the title documents. He'd been on the streets for 8 months. Derek took Greg under his wing those first few weeks, showed him the ropes, where to get a cheap meal, where to charge your phone for free, how to stay invisible enough that police didn't hassle you, but visible enough that charities could find you if they were distributing food. Derek also explained the psychology of being homeless in Thailand. The shame was overwhelming. Most Western men couldn't accept it, would rather suffer silently than call family back home and admit what had happened. Pride kept them on the streets. Fear of judgment. Embarrassment at having fallen for obvious scams. Greg understood. He hadn't called his sister in Seattle, hadn't told his former business partners, hadn't contacted anyone from his old life. How could he explain that he'd been a millionaire in January and homeless in February? That he'd given nearly $2 million to a woman who'd disappeared? That he'd been so thoroughly conned he'd lost everything? The American embassy knew. Greg had gone there for help. They'd been sympathetic, but limited in what they could do. They could help with emergency repatriation, get him a flight back to the U.S. But Greg had no home to return to, no job, no income, except eventual Social Security that wouldn't start for another 4 years. Going back to Seattle meant being homeless there instead of Bangkok. At least Bangkok had warmer weather. The embassy had also helped Greg file paperwork to access his frozen bank accounts. But the process was slow. Required affidavits, notarizations, proof of identity theft. Documentation Greg didn't have because all his records were locked in the Mahanakan condo he could no longer access. Meanwhile, Greg's visa was expiring. He'd been in Thailand on a 1-year tourist visa that required border runs every 90 days. His last entry stamp was from December. He was now overstaying. Every day he remained was an illegal day. If police checked his passport, he'd be arrested, fined, and deported. But deportation required money. Overstay fines. Flight costs. Greg had neither. He was trapped. Too broke to leave legally. Too illegal to stay safely. In mid-February, a volunteer organization called Home of New Beginnings found Greg. They did outreach to homeless foreigners, provided meals, medical care when possible, helped with paperwork. Their founder was a Thai-British woman named Achara, who'd seen too many foreigners destroyed by scams and wanted to help. Achara gave Greg a meal and listened to his story. When he finished, she said she'd heard versions of his story hundreds of times. The details varied, different women, different amounts, different scams, but the pattern was always the same. Wealthy foreign man, sophisticated Thai woman, fake investment opportunity, systematic theft, total collapse. She said the woman who'd scammed Greg was probably part of an organized network. These weren't individual con artists. They were coordinated operations, teams of people working together. The beautiful girlfriend, the reliable brother, the professional lawyer, all playing roles, all extracting money, then disappearing when the target was fully depleted. Achara said she'd help Greg. First priority, getting his U.S. funds unfrozen so he had resources. Second priority, resolving his visa status so he wasn't constantly risking arrest. Third priority, finding him temporary housing so he wasn't on the streets. Over the next month, Achara worked miracles. She helped Greg navigate the U.S. banking bureaucracy, provided documentation, vouched for his identity. By mid-March, Greg's accounts were unfrozen. He had access to his remaining $120,000. Achara also connected Greg with an immigration lawyer who specialized in overstay situations. The lawyer negotiated with immigration officials, paid Greg's overstay, fine 30,000 baht, about $900, and arranged a 60-day extension to sort out his status properly. Achara's organization also provided temporary housing, a shared room in a halfway house for homeless foreigners in Pattaya. Basic but clean. A place to sleep, to shower, to begin rebuilding. Greg moved to Pattaya in April, started trying to piece his life back together. He had money again, $119,000, after paying the overstay, fine, and other immediate costs. But he was 65 now. His visa situation was precarious. His mental state was fragile. He'd lost nearly $2 million and spent 6 weeks homeless. The trauma was overwhelming. A therapist at Home of New Beginnings, a volunteer psychologist from Australia, met with Greg weekly, helped him process the betrayal, the humiliation, the rage at himself for being so blind. The therapist said Greg was experiencing post-traumatic stress, not from violence, but from complete life collapse, the loss of identity, of security, of believing he understood how the world worked. The therapist also helped Greg understand he'd been targeted by professionals. This wasn't a random scam. Molly and her network had identified Greg as a high-value target, wealthy, lonely, intelligent but isolated. They'd studied him, crafted an approach specifically designed to exploit his vulnerabilities. The art gallery meeting? Probably staged. Molly had likely been watching Greg for weeks before the chance encounter. This wasn't Greg's fault. He'd been hunted by predators who were very, very good at what they did. That helped. Slightly. But Greg still couldn't forgive himself for ignoring warning signs, for trusting completely, for believing Molly loved him, when every signal said this was transactional. In May 2021, Greg received a call from a detective at Thailand's Economic Crime Suppression Division. They'd been investigating financial fraud operations in Bangkok. Greg's police report had come to their attention. They wanted to talk. Greg met with Detective Sawat at the police headquarters. Sawat was 40-ish, spoke excellent English, and had worked financial crimes for 15 years. He said Greg's case matched a pattern they'd been tracking: sophisticated long cons targeting wealthy foreigners, fake property developments, systematic theft, complete disappearance of perpetrators. Sawat said they'd identified at least 8 similar cases over the past 3 years. Different victims, different details, but same basic structure. Professional woman befriends wealthy foreign man, introduces a brother or cousin with investment opportunity, extracts money, disappears. Total documented theft across 8 cases, approximately $15 million. Greg asked if they'd caught anyone. Sawat said they'd arrested 2 women and 1 man. But the operations were sophisticated, used fake identities. Money was laundered immediately. Hard to prove who was involved. The people arrested claimed they were victims too, manipulated by others they couldn't identify. Sawat asked Greg if he could identify Molly if he saw her. Greg said yes, absolutely. He'd lived with her for over a year. He could identify her. Sawat showed Greg photographs, 6 different Thai women, asked if Greg recognized any. Greg pointed immediately to one. That was Molly. Sawat nodded, said her real name wasn't Patcharaporn Srizawan. That was an identity she'd purchased. Her real name was Nitya Chayaporn. Age 34, not 29. From Ubon Ratchathani, not Chiang Mai. She had a criminal record, arrested twice for fraud in 2014 and 2016. Both times, cases were dismissed due to insufficient evidence or victims not pursuing prosecution. She'd been working with a team. Her actual husband, not Somchai, not a brother, was named Wichai Chayaporn. He ran the operation, created fake companies, forged documents, moved money. Nitya's job was recruiting and managing victims, building relationships, extracting funds. She was the face. He was the infrastructure. Sawat said they'd been tracking Wichai for 2 years, but he was smart. Always stayed legal side of the line. Never held assets in his own name. Never personally received money. Everything through companies and nominees. Hard to prove criminal activity. But Greg's case might change that. Greg had extensive documentation. Bank transfers, company records, photos with Molly, evidence of the systematic extraction. If Greg was willing to testify, they might build a prosecutable case. Greg said absolutely. He'd testify. He wanted Molly Nitya arrested, wanted Wichai arrested, wanted them to face consequences. Sawat said it would take time. They needed to find Nitya and Wichai. Probably left Thailand after completing Greg's scam, likely in Laos or Cambodia. But Sawat had contacts. If they were in Southeast Asia, he'd find them. Over the next 3 months, Sawat built his case. He contacted Greg's victims, got their documentation, interviewed them, built a comprehensive file showing pattern of behavior, consistent methodology, coordinated operation. In August, Sawat got a break. Nitya was spotted in Pattaya, not hiding, living openly under a different name, working the same operation on a new victim. A German man who'd recently moved to Thailand. She was in the early stages building trust, establishing relationship. Sawat coordinated with local police, set up surveillance, gathered evidence of her operating under false identity, building case for fraud. They wanted to catch her in the act of requesting money. Hard proof of intent to defraud. The surveillance lasted 3 weeks. In early September, Nitya asked her German target for a substantial sum, 60,000 euros for a fake property investment. The German, warned by police, played along, transferred the money while police monitored. Nitya withdrew it immediately, converted to gold. Police arrested her at the gold shop. She had 60,000 euros worth of gold in her bag. Her phone had messages to Wichai coordinating the operation, bank records showing pattern of deposits and immediate conversions, evidence of multiple identities. Sawat called Greg, said Nitya was in custody. They'd be filing charges for multiple counts of fraud. Greg's case, the German's case, at least 3 other victims Sawat had identified. Total charges: fraud, money laundering, identity theft. If convicted, Nitya faced 15 to 20 years in prison. Greg asked about the money. Could he recover anything? Sawat said they'd seized Nitya's assets, a car, some jewelry, bank accounts with about $20,000 total. When liquidated and split among victims, Greg might receive 3,000 to 5,000. Not much. but something. Greg didn't care about the money at that point. He cared about justice, about Nataya facing consequences, about preventing her from destroying anyone else. Sawat said Wichai was still at large, but they'd issued warrants, frozen accounts tied to him. He couldn't operate easily anymore. Eventually, they'd catch him too. In October, Greg attended Nataya's arraignment. First time he'd seen her since she'd vanished. She looked different, harder, older, no makeup. Not the elegant woman from the art gallery, just a criminal in handcuffs. She saw Greg in the courtroom. Their eyes met. She looked away quickly. No remorse, no acknowledgement, just cold indifference. The prosecutor asked if Greg wanted to make a statement. Greg stood, said he wanted the court to understand the impact. This wasn't just about money. It was about destroying lives. Greg had spent 6 weeks homeless because of Nataya, lost everything he'd built over 40 years. Other victims had suffered similarly. Some never recovered. This needed to stop. Nataya needed to be imprisoned not just as punishment but as protection. As long as she was free, she was a threat to every vulnerable foreigner in Thailand. The judge thanked Greg. Set trial date for December. Nataya pled not guilty, claimed she'd been forced into the scams by Wichai, said he'd threatened her, controlled her. She was a victim too. Her lawyer presented her as an abused woman manipulated by a criminal husband. The prosecutor systematically destroyed that defense. Showed Nataya had been arrested for fraud before meeting Wichai. Showed phone records where she initiated contact with victims. Coordinated with Wichai as an equal partner. Laughed in messages about how much money they were extracting. She wasn't a victim. She was a predator. Greg testified. Described the entire relationship, how Molly had carefully built trust, introduced the villa scam, stolen from his accounts, sold his condo, the methodical, calculated destruction. The German victim testified. His experience was nearly identical, same approach, same fake warmth, same systematic theft. 2 other victims testified remotely via video. Both had similar stories. All featured the same woman using different names and slightly different approaches, but same core methodology. The trial lasted 5 days. In late December, the judge delivered the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Fraud, money laundering, identity theft. Sentence, 18 years in prison. Restitution orders for all victims. Asset liquidation to partially repay stolen funds. Nataya showed no emotion, just stood silently as sentence was read. She'd be 62 when released, if she served the full sentence. Most of her adult life gone. Greg felt relief. Not joy, not satisfaction, just relief. She couldn't hurt anyone else for 18 years. That mattered more than anything. Outside the courthouse, Detective Sawat thanked Greg for his testimony. Said most victims didn't follow through. Too embarrassed, too defeated. Greg's willingness to testify had been crucial to conviction. Sawat also said they'd arrested Wichai the previous week in Cambodia. Extradition was in progress. He'd face trial next year. The entire network was collapsing. Because Greg had been willing to tell his story, to face the humiliation, to help build the case. In January 2022, Greg received about $23,000 from asset liquidation. Split among multiple victims. His share was small, but combined with his remaining funds, he now had about $140,000. Not wealth, but enough to survive carefully. Greg stayed in Pattaya, rented a small studio apartment. 8,000 baht monthly, about $240. Simple life, modest, but stable. He also started teaching English online. Remote work for a Chinese education company, $20 per hour, 20 hours per week, $400 weekly, $1,600 monthly. Combined with careful spending, he could survive on his teaching income and let his remaining savings recover slowly. But more importantly, Greg found purpose in helping others. Home of New Beginnings asked him to volunteer, speak to newly arrived foreigners about scam awareness, share his story as cautionary tale, help others spot warning signs before they lost everything. Greg agreed, started giving talks at expat meetups, community centers. He'd tell his full story, every humiliating detail, the homeless weeks, the total collapse. Not to elicit sympathy, but to demonstrate that this could happen to anyone, that intelligence didn't protect you, that wealth didn't protect you, that being careful wasn't enough against professionals. His talks were popular, powerful, raw. People would come up afterward thanking him, saying they'd been considering similar investments, similar relationships. His story had made them pause, reconsider, protect themselves. Greg helped establish a support network for scam victims, safe space to share stories without judgment, resource sharing, emotional support, practical advice on recovery. The group grew. Dozens of members, all men who'd lost money in Thailand, all trying to rebuild. Greg turned 66 in August 2022. 3 years since he'd met Molly. 2 years since losing everything. 1 year since her conviction. He was alive, functioning, earning modest income, living in a small apartment in Pattaya. Nothing like the life he'd imagined when he'd sold his company for millions. But he was surviving. More importantly, he was helping others survive. His volunteer work had expanded. He now coordinated with several NGOs focused on protecting foreigners from scams. He'd helped draft educational materials, warning guides for new arrivals, red flag checklists, resource lists for victims. He'd also connected with Thai authorities, helped them understand how these scams worked from the victim's perspective, what made them effective, why intelligent men fell for obvious cons, the psychology of manipulation. Greg had learned the science of why he'd been vulnerable, the isolation after his divorce, the decades spent prioritizing work over relationships, the loneliness of achievement without connection. Molly had identified those vulnerabilities immediately, exploited them systematically. She'd given Greg exactly what he was missing: intellectual connection, apparent partnership, validation that he was more than just a wealthy target. She'd made him feel seen. That was worth more to Greg than the money. And that's why he'd ignored warning signs, because losing that feeling felt worse than losing dollars. That's what made these scams so devastating. They weren't just financial theft. They were emotional exploitation, weaponizing human needs, making victims feel like they'd been fundamentally wrong about their own judgment, about their ability to assess people and situations. Recovery required more than regaining money. It required rebuilding self-trust, accepting that you'd been targeted by professionals while not letting that destroy your ability to connect with others. That was the hard part. The money was just money. The psychological damage was much harder to repair. Greg worked with the volunteer psychologist regularly, processed the trauma, worked through the shame, gradually accepted that he'd done nothing wrong by wanting connection. He'd just been unlucky enough to encounter someone skilled at exploiting that want. By late 2022, Greg was doing okay. Not great, but okay. He'd accepted his new life, smaller, humbler, but meaningful in ways his millionaire life never had been. He was helping people, making actual difference. That felt better than wealth had. Greg is 68 now, still in Pattaya, still teaching English online, still volunteering with scam prevention organizations, still living in his small studio. His life is unrecognizable from 4 years ago, but it's his, honest, purposeful, real. He gives talks monthly at expat meetups in Pattaya, Phuket, Chiang Mai, and Bangkok. Always tells the full story. Millionaire to homeless. The details matter because they show how completely someone can be dismantled by skilled con artists. His message is consistent. I spent my life making sure no one could ever scam me. I was shrewd, analytical, successful, and she did it with a smile. I thought I was the teacher, the experienced businessman helping a young woman build her career. Turns out I was the lesson, the example of how anyone, no matter how smart, can be destroyed if they're lonely enough and the con artist is good enough. He emphasizes that these aren't random opportunistic crimes. They're sophisticated operations. Professional networks, people who study psychology, practice their approach. Target specific victim profiles. They're not amateurs, they're professionals, and they're very, very good. Greg tells newcomers, verify everything independently. Don't accept documents at face value. Don't trust that someone's warmth equals honesty. Protect your assets legally before emotional entanglement. Keep control of your finances. And if something feels too perfect, it probably is. But he also says, don't let fear prevent connection. Not every Thai woman is a scammer. Not every opportunity is fraud. Most relationships are legitimate. Most business deals are honest. The key is careful verification while remaining open. Balance. Caution without paranoia. That's the hardest part. After being destroyed, trusting again feels impossible. But living in total isolation is its own kind of death. So you learn to verify, to protect yourself, to move slowly. But you don't close off completely. Greg hasn't dated since Molly. Can't imagine it. The thought of being vulnerable again terrifies him. But he has friends, community, people who care whether he's okay. That's connection, not romantic, but real. He's recovered about 40,000 of the nearly 2 million he lost. The rest is gone, spent, laundered, disappeared. He'll never be a millionaire again. We'll never have the luxury condo. We'll never retire in the comfort he'd planned. But he's alive, functional, helpful. His suffering has purpose, it warns others, protects others, prevents others from making his mistakes. Molly Nataya sits in prison. Will sit there until she's 52 if she serves her full sentence. Wichai was convicted in 2023, sentenced to 22 years. Their network dismantled, other members arrested or scattered. They destroyed Greg's life, but Greg helped destroy their operation. That's not revenge, that's accountability, that's consequences. Greg's final message to anyone considering retirement in Thailand or any foreign country: come with open eyes and an open heart. Enjoy the culture, meet people, build relationships. But protect your assets, verify claims, keep control. Because in Thailand, like anywhere, the most expensive investment is always love, especially when it's not real. Greg Dawson sits in his small Pattaya apartment preparing for tonight's talk at an expat community center. He's speaking to a group of recently arrived retirees. Most have substantial savings. Most are lonely. Most are vulnerable to exactly the kind of operation that destroyed Greg. His laptop shows his PowerPoint presentation. Slides with warning signs, red flags, protection strategies, statistics about romance fraud in Thailand, photos of himself before and during his homeless period. The contrast is striking. The same man, completely different circumstances. Greg's phone rings. It's another victim seeking advice. This one is a Canadian in Chiang Mai who suspects his girlfriend is stealing from him. Greg listens, asks questions, helps the man see patterns, suggests protection strategies, recommends lawyers who can help. After the call, Greg makes instant coffee and sits by his window, watches the street below, tourists walking to the beach, expats riding motorcycles, life happening, normal life. He's part of it again. Not wealthy, not impressive, but present, contributing, surviving. He thinks about his old life sometimes. The Seattle mansion, the luxury condo, the millions in the bank. That version of Greg Dawson was successful, but empty. This version, the one in a budget apartment teaching English online, is poorer but more human, more connected, more real. Molly took his money, but she couldn't take his capacity to rebuild, his ability to help others, his choice to make meaning from disaster. That's the victory. Not wealth, not revenge, but survival with purpose, recovery with meaning, and the determination that his destruction will prevent others' destruction. Greg finishes his coffee, closes his laptop, heads to the community center. Tonight, he'll tell his story again. And maybe, just maybe, someone will hear it and protect themselves. That's worth more than the $2 million he'll never recover. Because money can be rebuilt. Lives can be rebuilt. But only if you survive the collapse. Only if you choose rebuilding over surrender. Greg survived. And now he helps others survive. That's his retirement. That's his legacy. Not what he built with money, but what he built after losing everything. If you found this story valuable, please subscribe to support more investigative documentaries about love scams and true crime. Your support helps me continue creating these important stories. Thank you for watching.